Alright, in this video we're going to talk about if statements, and we use if statements to control how our program responds to certain situations. So for example, a lot of times we let users set the values of variables. So if a user sets a variable to one thing, then we want certain code to run. But if they set the variable to another thing, then we want other code to run. So a lot of times in our programs we write lots of code and not all of it runs because depending on what's going on in our program, some code runs and other code doesn't. So we can kind of control this flow of code by using if statements. And if statements are known as control structures because they control the flow of code. Alright, so the file that we're looking at is called Controlling the Flow of Code Execution with If Statements. That's this one right here. And I've got that up in Sublime Text right here. And I've also got it up in the browser right here. So this is what you should be looking at. And so I guess we need to start with the syntax first. I'll down here on line 25 you can see what's in that pre-tag, and this kind of shows you the basic syntax of an if statement. So an if statement starts out with this keyword here, so that's a keyword or a reserved word in JavaScript that has special meaning. So if we want to create an if statement, it starts with if, and then we've got these parentheses, and inside the parentheses we put a Boolean expression. Now we'll talk about what a Boolean expression is, but don't worry, it's not that bad. So we start out with if, and then inside of the parentheses after if we put in a Boolean expression, and then we've got curly braces. So right here on line 25 there's our opening curly brace, and then it's matching closing curly braces down here on line 31. And all of the code that's in between those curly braces is the code that's going to run if our Boolean expression resolves to true. Okay, so let's talk about Boolean expressions. First of all, we know what an expression is because we've talked about that from our other classes, but just to review, it's an expression is like a mathematical equation such as 5 plus 6. So we can solve that. 5 plus 6, we can solve that so that it evaluates to 11. Well, a Boolean expression is an expression that can be solved to either true or false. So let's look at an example of a Boolean expression here. So right down here on line 37, here is a Boolean expression, and I guess I'll leave it up to you to figure out if it's true or false. But I think if you look at it, you'll be able to see that 5 is greater than 3 plus 1, and that is true. So there's an example of a Boolean expression. An expression that when we solve it, it either the answer is either true or false. Okay, so I've got that in an example down here. I'm going to uncomment the code on line 41, and the closing comment is on 47. But right here I've taken that Boolean expression and put it inside of an if statement. So if I save this and bounce back over to the browser, and I need to get rid of this here. If I refresh the page, you'll see I see an alert that says, yep, the Boolean expression evaluates to true, which is why this alert code is running right now. So let's take a look at that code real quick and break it down. Okay, so here's my if statement. It starts with the keyword if, and then we put parentheses, and inside those parentheses goes a Boolean expression. So here's my Boolean expression. So, and then we have our curly brace right here, the opening curly brace, and down here on line 45 is the closing curly brace, and then inside we have code that shows an alert. So this expression is indeed true, which means that this code is going to run right here. Now, what would happen if this expression resolved to false? Well, in this case, we just won't run any code at all. So we'll just run some code if the expression is true, and if it's not true, we don't do anything. So that's the simplest form of an if statement. So I'm going to put the comments back in. Let's check out another one here. So here's a slightly different version of the if statement, and this will allow us to run code even if the Boolean expression resolves to false. So right here on line 55, we've got an if statement, or we start it with our keyword if, and then we have our parentheses, and inside the parentheses is our Boolean expression. If that expression turns out to be true, then the code inside the curly braces, so I'm talking about this curly brace here on line 55 and this closing curly brace on line 61. So if this Boolean expression is true here on line 55, then this code here will run. But if that expression on line 55 evaluates to false, then we'll run this code. So this is, you can see how this is different than the other if statement that we use, because we only ran code if the expression was true. But if we use this form of the if statement, we can run different code if that Boolean expression is false. Alright, so I think it's about time now where we kind of showed you a more practical example of how you'd use these if statements. So if you go down to line 72 here, remove the comment there, and then its closing comment is over here on line 81, and now I've uncommented a script here that we can take a look at, and the code inside the script looks like this. So here on line 74 we are declaring a variable, and the variable's name is guess, and then we're using the prompt function and passing in a question. And you know what, I think maybe we just better run this one first and then look at the code. So let's go ahead and save it, go back over to the browser, hit refresh, and I'll see this prompt pop up, and it says, who was the first president of the US? So I think I know the answer. I'll type it in and hit OK here, and I see an alert that says correct, you win. Alright, so let's look at the code. So we declare a variable that we name guess, and the value that we assign to that variable is going to be the result of this prompt function call, and that prompt has the question in it, who was the first president of the United States. So when the user types in their answer will be stored in this guess variable, and then we can go to our if statement here on the next line, and what we're saying here is if guess equals George Washington, if that's true, if guess does equal George Washington, then we're going to show an alert that says correct, you win. But if that's false, if this Boolean expression here on line 75 turns out to be false, meaning that the value of this variable guess is not equal to George Washington, then we'll run this code in the else portion in between these two curly braces here and here, and it'll alert, sorry, you lose. Okay, so I think this is pretty straightforward and intuitive, but you might be wondering about these double equal signs here. When I want to see if a variable is holding a certain value, you might think that you could do this: guess equals George Washington. If you say it, it sounds kind of like that's the way it should be. But we know from earlier lessons that that single equal sign is already an operator that we use for something else, and that's the assignment operator. So if my code looked like this right here, if I just had guess equals George Washington, what do you think would happen with my code here? We know that the equal sign, all by just one equal sign, is called the assignment operator, and we use it to assign values to variables, and that's exactly what would happen right here. We would take whatever was being stored by the guess variable, and we'd reinitialize it to George Washington, which is not what we want. Now, I'm not sure how that's going to affect our Boolean expression, but I don't think it'll work properly anymore. But anyways, the point is when you're trying to compare two values to see if they're equal, then you use the double equal sign, and the double equal sign is called the equality operator, and we'll see a lot more about operators pretty soon too. So alright, so that's it for the if-else version of the if statement. Scroll on down here. I'm going to actually put the comments back in the code there. Scroll down to line 101. Let's remove the comment here. Now this example, I think we want to run it first, and then we'll talk about it later. So the closing comment is on line 117. So now I've uncommented that whole entire script. I'm going to save it, go over to the browser, run it, and we see a prompt that says enter a color. Use all lowercase letters please. JavaScript is case sensitive. We'll learn how to deal with that whole case sensitive issue a little bit later. So I'm going to put in a color. I'm going to enter blue, and I see that the alert message says, what's the matter, not feeling well today? Anyways, depending on what you enter, you might see a different alert. So let's look at the code. And here on line 104, we have a variable declared, and it's called color, and the value that we're assigning to that variable is going to be the return value of this prompt function call. And we know what prompt does, and we know what it returns. What it returns is whatever they enter into that input box that appears in that prompt window. So color is going to be set to whatever they enter. And now we go down to our if statement. If the color is equal to red, then we'll do this alert here on line 107. But we've got an else if here, and it says if the color is equal to blue, then we'll do this alert right here. And another else if the color is equal to yellow, then we'll show this alert. And if none of these Boolean expressions turned out to be true, we've got an else clause. I think you call it a clause, I'm not sure, but we've got an else here that alerts, not sure what to tell you, but you didn't enter red, blue, or yellow. So in between the curly braces for this else here on line 112, this is kind of our catch-all for if we didn't account for one of the colors that they entered. So now, just to give you an idea of how these if statements work, what's going to happen here is as soon as it finds a Boolean expression that evaluates to true. So let's just say I entered blue, which is what I actually did. So this Boolean expression is going to be checked, and it's going to come out to false. So in that case, we move on down to the next Boolean expression. If this Boolean expression turns out to be true, then it's going to run the code in between the curly braces. So the curly brace here, and this is the closing curly brace. So that code in between those curly braces is going to run, and then everything else after that for the rest of the if statement is going to get skipped. So in that case, if we had entered blue, this line of code on line 109 would run, and then as soon as that was done running, JavaScript would go down here and start looking for the next line of code to run. So as soon as one of your Boolean expressions turns out to be true, it runs the code inside the curly brace for that expression and then skips everything else. That's how they work. So if, for example, I change this blue to red, this doesn't make any sense, but just to show you how this would work is if I did enter red into the prompt, then this Boolean expression would turn out to be true and this code would run. And effectively, with the code the way I have it now, this line of code would never ever run. It's impossible for it to run because this expression would turn out to be true and this code would run, and then the code execution would get out of the if statement altogether. So the code execution would jump down to the end of the if statement and then start looking for the next line of code to run after that. So sometimes you got to be careful. Right here, this is called dead code because it's impossible for this code to run. Because if this is true, this first Boolean expression, if that's true, then this code will always run here on line 107, and then the code execution will break out of this whole entire if statement and go down here and start looking for code. So this would be dead code in this case. I'm going to change that back to blue. Okay, so there's another variation of the if statement. So we can check for multiple Boolean expressions, and if any one of them are true, we can choose what code to run. And if none of them are true, then we can have an else clause that will handle all other situations. Or the situation where none of the Boolean expressions are true, I guess is what I should say. Alright, what else? Now I'm going to go ahead and put the comments back in here on 117 and 101. And scroll down to the next example here. On 160 I have a script tag. I'm going to go ahead and remove the comments here, and let's just go ahead and talk about this one. You can go ahead and run it if you want. This one's quite a bit more complicated, and the whole point of this example is to show you that if statements can be nested inside of one another. And it can get to be a little bit complicated, but you do this a lot in your programs because a lot of times our programs are complicated, so there's a lot of different variables we have to account for. In this example, we're asking here on line 163 if the user likes books. Do you like books? It says. Enter yes or no. So the value of this variable called likes books should be either yes or no. So then we start our if statement, and it says if likes books equals yes. Then we go down to line 168 and we ask the user, well, do you like sci-fi books? Enter yes or no. So at that point we have this variable called likes sci-fi, and that should be either yes or no, and we have another if statement right here. So notice how this if statement that I've got highlighted here is nested inside of this if statement that starts up here on line 165. So just kind of to recap, we ask them if they like books. If they like books, then our code execution goes into here. It starts on line 168. And we know that they like books, so we can ask them if they like sci-fi books. So after line 168, we can check to see if they like sci-fi books. If they said yes, then we show them this alert, and if they didn't say yes, then we show them this alert. So if they do like sci-fi books, we'll recommend that they read Frankenstein, and if they said anything other than yes to that prompt, it would recommend that they read Gone with the Wind. Okay, so all that code right there will get run if they said they like books back up here. So what happens if they don't like books? Well, if they entered no into that prompt when they were asked if they like books up here on line 163, let's say they enter no, well, this Boolean expression is false, so we skip all this code and go down to the else if that goes with that if statement. And we got another Boolean expression that says if likes books equals no, then we run some more code in here. So if they don't like books, then we ask them if they like movies. So that's what this prompt is doing. So whatever they enter, they're supposed to enter yes or no. And so this likes movies variable on line 179 should be either yes or no. Then we have another if statement. Notice how this if statement is nested inside of this guy. The curly braces on line 176 and 187. So I've got a whole if statement nested inside of those curly braces. So if they said they like movies, if they answered yes to that question, then we can recommend social networking for them to watch that. And if they didn't enter yes, then we can recommend that they learn how to knit. Okay, so that handles that all that code right there starts with whether they like books or not, and they were supposed to enter yes or no. But what happens if they don't enter yes and they don't enter no into that prompt? Well, we should account for that, and that's what this else clause here is for. So if the previous two Boolean expressions turn out to be false, then we'll end up in this code block here. So, and when I say code block, I mean we'll be inside these curly braces. The one here on 187, and then its closing pair here on 191. And so what we'll do in that case is we'll just say it was a yes/no question. So remind them they were supposed to enter yes or no. Alright, this is just a crude little simple example, but I think it demonstrates how the if statements work. And that's all you need to know about if statements for now. If you understood all that, you're doing pretty good. I think it's just a matter of practicing. And like I said, they can get to be kind of complicated when they get nested. They can be nested quite a bit. There is one more thing I want to show you. I'm going to go ahead and put the comments back in here on line 193 and 160, and I'm going to scroll on down to the next example. And I want to show you where an example where we use if statements quite a bit. A lot of times we don't know if a variable has been set to a value. We might have a variable somewhere in our program, and maybe we let the user assign a value to it, and maybe they forgot to. But anyways, it's a good idea to use an if statement to check and see if a variable has been set. So what I've got here on line 207, I'll go ahead and comment out this script tag here so we can see the code coloring. So we'll go back up to line 207. We see that I'm declaring a variable called x, but I'm not assigning a value to it. So we can basically think of this being a null value. The value of this variable is null, meaning there is no value. Now in JavaScript there's kind of two versions of null, but we're not going to talk about that right now. So anyways, the variable's been declared, but it hasn't been set to a value. So what I could do here is I could put that variable inside an if statement, or inside of the Boolean expression part of an if statement, and if it's been set, it should resolve to true, and then I can run this code here. So if it's been set, I can work with it and do something with it, but I may want to check first, because if it's not set, I might want my code to do something else, like you know, maybe flash up an error message or something like that. Who knows? It all depends on what your program's doing. Now this comes in handy, and we do this a lot, and I've got another example of a more practical example of that here, and I'll leave that up to you to kind of look at that and see what you think. But I do want to point out that there is a caveat to doing this, and that's when, look at this, if I set x equal to 0 here, okay, if your variable is set to 0, that will always resolve to false in a Boolean expression, because in computers 0 and false are treated as the same thing. It's just kind of one of those gotchas that you got to remember. So if your variable is set to 0, that will always resolve to false inside of this a Boolean expression like that. So you got to be careful with this, and if it's possible that your variable could be set to 0, then you'd have to write some other code to check, and I can show you how to do that later when we talk about operators. We can check, we can find out, we can get a Boolean, we can create a Boolean expression that would tell us whether the variable's been set or if it's just been set to 0. So anyways, I just wanted to throw that out there, and I think that's all you need to know about if statements for now.